Shalom, everyone. Welcome back. It's Rabbi Leider sharing with you some ideas about this coming week. This coming Shabbos is the Shabbos of Parshas Akev. And in this Parsha, this is said just before the Jewish people entered the land of Israel and Moshe Rabbeinu died. There is an interesting verse from the Torah, which is quoted very often by the Rebbe. It was quoted very often by the Rebbe in his talks, his Farbrengens. That verse is referring to the land of Israel as Eretz Asher Ein Elokecha Ba, the land in which the eye of God is on it, Mireshis Hashana V'ad Ach Roshana, from the beginning of the year, namely Rosh Hashanah, till the end of the year. That Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is a very, very special place. It's a place that God's eye is on it. God, in other words, God watches over the land of Israel more than any other place on earth. There's a holiness to the land of Israel. And these days when Israel is in the news so much, and the politics and the back and the forth and the BDS and all of this nonsense, it's interesting. It's worthwhile for us to reflect on a different aspect of the land of Israel, and that aspect is the area of holiness, of godliness, which rests on the land of Israel. Before Israel was formed as a state, the Zionist organizations were offered Uganda because Israel was very contentious. Arabs were there, and there was different politics and things like that. And actually, the early Zionist leaders were thinking about it. They, not a bad idea. Maybe let's go to Uganda. What difference does it make where we put our state or not? They were connected to the land of Israel, but not so much not to consider other options. Although the Jewish people would never have thought of such a thing. For the Jewish people, there was only one land. In fact, in Hebrew, the Israelis referred to the land of Israel as Aretz. Are you going to Aretz? Aretz, the land. What land are they referring to? They're not referring to Canada. They're referring to the land of Israel. There is a kedusha, there's a holiness to the land of Israel. When the Jewish people keep mitzvahs, when the Jewish people are connected to the land of Israel and regard the land of Israel as a primary place of real estate for them, then we find that God's eye certainly rests on there, and God is always watching over there as never before. God is always there. God is always watching over the land of Israel, but there's a special blessing associated with the land when the Jewish people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, specifically in the land of Israel. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe regarded the land of Israel very, very highly, and he spoke of it all the time. The Rebbe never visited Israel. Interestingly, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe went there, and he traveled all over. He went to many, many different places in Israel in his lifetime in the early 1920s. But for some reason, the Rebbe never visited Israel. And people asked him, why, Lubavitcher Rebbe, why don't you go to Israel? Why don't you visit Israel and move to Israel even? And they never got a clear answer. The Rebbe would say that there are mitzvahs, many mitzvahs associated with going to Israel, and there are only three reasons why you can leave Israel: to find a parnasa, a livelihood, for example, livelihood, to find a shidduch, to get married, for example, and these types of things, or to study Torah. If you can study Torah better in a yeshiva someplace else, you're allowed to go to leave Israel for those reasons. But just to visit Israel, the Rebbe felt he couldn't do it. Perhaps the Rebbe had other reasons also. Maybe the Rebbe felt that at this time, the center of Jewish life in the world is New York, and therefore he would have more effect on people if his movement was centered in New York, because everyone regards the Americans and New York so highly. So maybe he felt that he should keep his movement in New York. If the Rebbe were to leave New York and move to Israel, certainly the Lubavitcher movement would have moved to Israel with him. No question about it. Right now, we have Chabad centers all over the land of Israel. In every town and village, there's Chabad. Chabad is a tremendous force in the land of Israel. And the Rebbe has sent many, many shluchim, many, many people to live there, to serve as rabbis, or just to live in the land of Israel. Because it has that kedusha, that special quality, and there we have many yeshivas there as well. But I think the Rebbe felt that if he ever went there, he would have to stay there, and the world is not ready for that yet. He needs to be in New York, And that's the reason. And perhaps he felt that if he were to go to Israel, Mashiach would come. That would be the end of it. That would be it. And for that and perhaps other reasons which we really don't know, the Rebbe never visited Israel. He never went to Israel, and he was not even buried in Israel. He's buried in Queens, New York. So it remains a tremendous enigma. Why didn't the Rebbe move to Israel? Most of us have been there before. We've traveled the length and the breadth of the land of Israel, and we are every time we go there, we are inspired by the dedication of the Jewish people who live in Israel and what they're doing there and how they're succeeding. And certainly God is blessing the land as never before. And God's blessing will always be in the land as never before. If we have an opportunity to go to Israel, we certainly should, and we should take our children there and our grandchildren there. We should bring groups there and strengthen the land of Israel in every way we can, financially, morally, spiritually. And when a Jew puts on tefillin, the Rebbe would say, when we put on tefillin here in America or wherever we're living outside of Israel, it affects the Jewish people in Israel also. During the 1967 war, the Rebbe made a great campaign that everybody should put on tefillin every day, Jewish men and boys from the age of 13 and up, because he said that putting on tefillin here strengthens Jews in Israel and strengthens the war effort in Israel and gives a certain impetus to what's going on over there. So when we do a mitzvah here, especially the mitzvah tefillin, it strengthens Jews there, it strengthens the Israeli army and the Israeli resolve as never before. So we should consider that as a way to contribute to Israel here, even without being there. This coming Sunday in the synagogue in Chabad University City, we're having a very special guest, Colonel Peled, who was a top officer in the Israeli army, who served in the Mossad, and he was one of the first people to go to Mumbai after the terrible terrorist attack there. He helped the Israeli army to clean up the mess that was left over there and all of the tragedy and tragic things that happened over there. And he's going to tell us about Mumbai and what happened over there and what it was like coming back to Mumbai after this attack. It's a lecture not to be missed. It'll be at 6 o'clock this Sunday evening at the synagogue. It'll be outside. We'll be observing all of the requirements of masks throughout the lecture and social distancing. But it's really something to be there for. If you can't make it, we will have it on Zoom as well. We'll post right here the link that you can post on Zoom also. So we hope you'll join us. It'll be Sunday at 6 p.m. Services are continuing throughout the week at 6:30 in the morning, 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, on Shabbos morning at 9 o'clock. During the week in the evening, we're davening at 7:30 this week for Mincha Maariv. We encourage you to come and join us. Bring your mask with you. Also, we're getting ready for the high holidays, and we encourage you to register for the high holidays. It's very important that we know how many people are attending so we can count on that and make sure we have the appropriate number of chairs and space them properly so that everyone will feel comfortable and feel safe. So that's it for now. Candlelighting tonight is at 7:24 in San Diego. We look forward to seeing you on Shabbos. Please be well and be safe. Shalom and Shabbat Shalom.